The words hang in the air like smoke after a volley, simple and steady, spoken by a man whose life had been anything but. Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. Thomas Johnson Jackson said them on the afternoon of May 10th, 1863, in a small room at a place called Guiney's Station, Virginia. The sun was sliding west across the fields outside, and inside, the air felt thick with the end of something enormous. He was 39 years old, a lieutenant general in the Confederate Army, and by every account that reached the newspapers within days, those were his last coherent words. Historians have turned them over for more than 160 years now, not because the facts are murky, plenty of people were in that room, but because the words themselves feel too perfectly carved, too quietly defiant for a soldier who had just been torn apart by his own men in the dark. They don't explain themselves, they simply arrive and then they stay. Jackson had spent the previous week fighting a different kind of battle, one he couldn't outflank or outmarch. 8 days earlier, on the night of May 2nd, he had ridden back through the wilderness after one of the most daring attacks of the entire Civil War. The Battle of Chancellorsville was supposed to be Robert E. Lee's masterpiece, and Jackson was the man Lee trusted to make it work. With the Union Army under Joseph Hooker spread out like a long blue ribbon through the tangled woods and clearings, Lee had split his own outnumbered force. He sent Jackson on a 12-mile march around the Union right flank, a gamble that should have failed a dozen times. Jackson's men moved through brush so thick that it tore at their uniforms, stepping over logs and dodging low branches, rifles held high. By late afternoon, they were in position. At 6 o'clock, they stepped out of the trees in perfect silence, and then, on Jackson's quiet order, they charged. The Union 11th Corps, mostly German immigrants who had been cooking supper, never saw it coming. The Confederate yell rolled across the fields like thunder, and the blue line shattered. Men dropped their rifles and ran. Jackson kept pushing. He wanted more. He rode forward again after dark, scouting the ground himself, because he always did, because the map in his head was never enough. That decision cost him everything. Around 9 o'clock, the woods were black. Jackson and a small party, staff officers, signalmen, a couple of couriers, were maybe 50 yards ahead of their own lines when the first shots cracked out. It was the 18th North Carolina Infantry, part of James Lane's brigade. They had heard horses moving in the dark and assumed it was Union cavalry trying to slip behind them. Someone shouted a challenge, someone else fired. Then the whole line opened up. Bullets snapped through the leaves. Captain R.E. Wilbourn later wrote that the first volley caught them cold. A signalman named Cunliffe fell dead almost at Jackson's stirrup. Jackson's horse, Little Sorrel, panicked and bolted. A low limb ripped the general's cap off. He tried to wheel the animal back toward safety, but the firing followed them. 3 bullets hit him almost at once, one through the upper left arm, shattering the bone and slicing the main artery, one through the left wrist, and one that tore into the palm of his right hand. Wilbourn caught up, grabbed the reins, and helped pull Jackson down. The general's voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "My arm is broken," then, after a pause, "and a slight wound in the right hand." They got him off the horse and under a tree while the friendly fire kept rattling around them. Jackson refused to complain. When someone asked if he was hurt badly, he simply nodded. They made a sling from a handkerchief, tied off the worst bleeding, and started carrying him rearward on a litter. Enemy shells began bursting overhead. Hooker's gunners had finally woken up. One of the litter bearers was hit and dropped his end. Jackson slammed to the ground on his wounded side. He groaned then, the only time anyone heard him do it. They picked him up again, found an ambulance, and got him to a field hospital, where Dr. Hunter McGuire was waiting. McGuire was 27, brilliant, and had once been dismissed by Jackson himself because he looked too young. Now he was the only man who could save the general's life. The amputation happened before midnight. Chloroform first. Jackson murmured something about an infinite blessing as he slipped under. McGuire took the left arm off 2 inches below the shoulder, cleaned the hand wound, and dressed everything as best he could in a tent lit by lanterns. Jackson woke up asking for General Stuart to take command of the Corps. He slept a little. The next morning, Lee's famous message arrived. "Could I have directed events, I should have chosen, for the good of the country, to have been disabled in your stead." Jackson read it and said quietly, "General Lee should give the praise to God." They moved himself to Guiney Station to keep him out of reach of any Union thrust. The journey was rough. The ambulance jolted over rutted roads, and Jackson grew nauseated. But he kept his composure. He told McGuire he wasn't afraid of capture because he had always been kind to Yankee wounded. For the first few days at the Chandler house, he seemed to improve. The wounds stayed clean. He ate. He smiled when his wife Anna arrived with their 5-month-old daughter Julia. He called the baby his little comforter and let her play on the bed. He prayed with Anna. He told her he was resigned to whatever came. Then, on May 7th, the fever started. McGuire diagnosed pleuropneumonia on the right side. Modern doctors, looking back at the records, have suggested it might have been a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot thrown off from the trauma and the long hours of shock. Either way, Jackson's breathing grew shallow. The pain in his side sharpened. He drifted in and out of consciousness. On the morning of May 10th, he told Anna he had always wanted to die on a Sunday. "My wish is fulfilled," he said. The afternoon slipped away in fragments. He gave orders to imaginary troops. "Order A.P. Hale to prepare for action. Pass the infantry to the front rapidly." Then caught himself and smiled. McGuire offered brandy and water to ease him. Jackson refused. "I want to preserve my mind, if possible, to the last." Someone told him he had perhaps 2 hours. He answered, "Very good, it is all right." A little after 3 o'clock, the delirium lifted for one final moment. His face relaxed. A smile, McGuire wrote later, of ineffable sweetness spread across it. Jackson spoke clearly, without strain. "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Then he was gone. The South stopped breathing when the news reached Richmond. Church bells tolled. Stores closed. Lee wrote to Jackson's widow that the army had lost its right arm. Jefferson Davis called him irreplaceable. Soldiers who had marched with him in the Shenandoah Valley sat down and cried openly. And yet, almost immediately, people began turning those last words over in their minds, the way you turn a smooth stone in your pocket. They are too neat, too poetic, too final for a man who spent his life quoting scripture and drilling troops until they dropped. Historians do it today because the words sit at the exact intersection of faith, delirium, memory, and myth.
First, there is the question of whether he really said them at all. The accounts come from people who were in the room or spoke to those who were. McGuire himself, Anna Jackson, aide James Power Smith. Newspapers printed the phrase within days. McGuire's full report appeared less than 3 years later. That's unusually fresh for Civil War deathbed stories. Still, memory is slippery. One historian who has studied the reliability of eyewitness testimony points out that even trained observers rewrite details every time they recall them. A few skeptics wonder if the words were polished afterward, shaped by the lost cause impulse to give Jackson a saintly exit. But the core phrase shows up too consistently, too early to dismiss outright. Most scholars accept that something very close to those words left his lips. The real puzzle is what they meant.
Jackson was a devout Presbyterian who read his Bible every day and believed providence guided every bullet. To him, death was never the end, it was a crossing. Some have seen the river as the Jordan of Scripture, the boundary between wilderness and promised land. Others point to the literal rivers of Jackson's life. He grew up near the West Fork River in what is now West Virginia, where a grove of poplars gave him shade as a lonely orphan. He taught at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, beside the Maury River he once called the most beautiful place on earth. He had defended the Shenandoah in 1862 with a brilliance that made his name. Was he seeing one of those rivers in his final seconds? Or simply, as his wife later suggested, picturing the river of death that leads to the trees of healing in the book of Revelation? Biographer James I. Robertson offered another layer. He imagined Jackson's mind running backward through his life, like a film in reverse. Battlefields giving way to lecture halls, to the Shenandoah Valley, finally to the riverbank of his childhood. The trees become the poplars that once sheltered a boy who lost his parents young. That reading feels intimate, almost cinematic, and it fits the man who could quote scripture one minute and calculate marching distances the next. But it remains speculation. Jackson never explained himself. He simply spoke and crossed. Then there is the medical layer. Jackson had been in and out of delirium for hours. Fever can produce hallucinations that feel utterly real to the sufferer. Was this a final hallucination, or a moment of lucidity so sharp it cut through the fog? McGuire, a careful observer, insisted the smile that accompanied the words was of relief, not confusion. Anna, who knew her husband better than anyone, believed it was a deliberate, peaceful farewell. Modern physicians reading the same symptoms sometimes lean towards the embolism theory. A clot lodged in the lung could have produced sudden calm after agitation, the body surrendering without struggle. But even that doesn't explain the poetry. The words have followed Jackson's legend ever since. Ernest Hemingway borrowed them for the title of his 1950 novel about an aging soldier facing mortality. Tour guides at Chancellorsville still quote them at the spot where the litter fell. Reenactors recite them around evening campfires. They've become shorthand for graceful acceptance in the middle of horror. Yet the more you sit with them, the less they resolve. They refuse to be pinned down. A river can be death or memory or geography. Shade can be rest or heaven or the cool grove of a Virginia boyhood. Jackson, the man who once told his troops that duty was the sublimest word in the language, left behind a sentence that feels like duty and surrender at the same time. Historians keep returning to that farmhouse room because the rest of Jackson's story is so sharply drawn. He was the eccentric professor who sucked lemons on the march and refused to eat pepper because it made his left leg weak. The Sunday school teacher who taught enslaved children to read when it was illegal. The hypochondriac who believed cold water harmed the body but could stand in a freezing stream to cure himself. The tactical genius who marched his foot cavalry so hard they called him an old blue light Presbyterian and loved him for it. He turned certain defeat into victory at First Manassas, terrorized 3 Union armies in the Shenandoah, and then, at Chancellorsville, executed the most audacious flank attack of the war. And then, in the space of a few minutes on a dark road, his own men ended it. The irony is almost unbearable. The Confederacy never quite recovered. Lee went on to Gettysburg without his right arm, and the rest is written in blood and hindsight. But the last words keep the mystery alive. They don't comfort in the usual way. They don't preach. They invite. They ask you to decide what river you would cross if the trees were waiting. For some listeners, they're pure faith. For others, they're the mind's last beautiful trick. For still others, they're proof that even the hardest fighter can find peace when the fighting is done. Whatever they are, they've refused to fade. In an age when historians chip away at every legend, looking for cracks, those words remain strangely intact, enigmatic, serene, and still capable of stopping a reader cold in the middle of a page. Jackson's body was taken home to Lexington. The funeral train moved slowly through the Virginia countryside while people lined the tracks and wept. He was buried in the cemetery he had chosen himself, under trees that still stand. Every spring the dogwoods bloom there, white against the green, and visitors still speak his last sentence under their breath, testing the weight of it. The historians keep debating. The rest of us keep listening, because some endings don't close the book. They simply open the next chapter in a voice we can't quite place from a shore we haven't reached yet. And that, perhaps, is why the words still puzzle us. They belong to Jackson, but they don't stay with him. They travel. They cross over. They ask us to follow, if only in imagination, and rest for a moment in the shade of whatever trees we